The auditorium was packed with proud families, cameras flashing like strobe lights as graduates walked across the stage. 4 years of late nights, endless coding projects, and ramen dinners had led to this moment. I adjusted my cap one last time and scanned the crowd, looking for familiar faces in the sea of celebration. There they were, row 12, center section. My parents, Robert and Linda Thompson, sitting with my siblings Jessica and Michael. But something felt off. While other families were cheering, taking photos, holding up signs with their graduate's name, mine sat stone-faced. My mother was scrolling through her phone. My father kept checking his watch, like he had somewhere more important to be. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. When they called my name, Maya Thompson, Bachelor of Science in Computer Science, Summa Cum Laude, I walked across that stage with my head held high. The applause from strangers felt warmer than the silence from my own family. As I shook the dean's hand and received my diploma, I caught a glimpse of my parents in the crowd. They weren't clapping, they weren't even looking. After the ceremony, families swarmed the courtyard, hugging their graduates, taking endless photos, planning celebration dinners. I found my family by the parking lot, already walking toward their car. No congratulations, no photos, no acknowledgement that their daughter had just graduated at the top of her class from one of the most demanding programs in the country. My father turned around as I approached, his face twisted with annoyance. "Well, that was a waste of 3 hours," he said loudly enough for other families to hear. 4 years and $60,000, so you could play with computers. You know what you are, Maya? You're just a burden, always have been, always will be. The words hit me like a physical blow. Other families stopped their conversations, turning to stare. My mother laughed that cruel laugh I knew so well. "At least it's over now," she said, not even looking at me. "Maybe you can finally start paying us back for all the money we wasted on you." Jessica and Michael stood there silently, neither defending me nor joining in, just uncomfortable witnesses to my humiliation. In that moment, surrounded by hundreds of celebrating family, I had never felt more alone. I smiled, the same smile I'd perfected over 22 years of being the family disappointment. The smile that said I'm fine when everything inside me was breaking. But this time, something was different. This time, the smile carried a secret they couldn't imagine. I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app, my fingers steady despite the storm inside me. With 3 quick taps, I initiated a wire transfer that would change everything. $750,000, the exact amount needed to purchase their mortgage from Cascade Home Lending. "You're right, Dad," I said, my voice calm as glass. "I am a burden. But funny thing about burdens, sometimes they get heavy enough to crush what's holding them." I held up my phone, showing them the transfer confirmation. "I just bought your mortgage. You have 30 days to pack." The silence that followed was deafening. My father's face went from smug satisfaction to confusion to something approaching terror. My mother's phone slipped from her hand, clattering onto the asphalt. Jessica's mouth fell open, and Michael took a step backward, like I'd just announced I had a contagious disease. "What did you just say?" my father whispered, his voice cracking on the last word. I couldn't help but laugh, not the bitter sound they'd grown accustomed to, but something genuine and free. "I said I bought your house, Dad. You know that computer stuff you've been mocking for 4 years? Turns out it pays pretty well." The parking lot around us had mostly emptied, but a few lingering families had stopped to watch our drama unfold. I could feel their eyes on us, probably wondering why a graduation celebration had turned into what looked like a business transaction. My mother found her voice first, that shrill tone she used when she wasn't getting her way. "That's impossible, you're just a student, you don't have that kind of money." I reached into my purse and pulled out a folder I'd been carrying since morning, extracting a crisp set of documents. Cascade Home Lending was very eager to work with me. Apparently, when you miss 6 months of payments, they're pretty motivated to sell to someone with cash. My father's face had gone pale. You've been spying on us. I've been paying attention, I corrected. There's a difference. When you spend years being invisible in your own family, you learn to notice things. Like how you two whisper about money problems when you think no one's listening. How you've been using credit cards to make house payments. How you've been lying to Jessica and Michael about how bad things really are. The truth was, I'd known about their financial problems for over a year. It started when I came home for spring break and noticed the overdue notices stacked on the kitchen counter. Mail my parents thought they'd hidden well enough. Bills they thought their burden of a daughter would never be smart enough to understand. But I understood more than they realized. While they saw my computer science degree as expensive playtime, I'd been building something they couldn't comprehend. Starting in my sophomore year, I'd begun freelancing, taking on small coding projects for local businesses. What began as beer money had evolved into something much bigger. By junior year, I wasn't just coding for small businesses anymore. I was developing custom software solutions for mid-sized companies, building mobile apps, creating e-commerce platforms. While my parents worried about my useless degree, I was making more money than either of them had ever seen. The biggest breakthrough came 8 months ago, when I landed a contract with a Seattle-based startup. They needed a complete overhaul of their data management system, and they needed it fast. The timeline was brutal, the requirements complex, but the payout was life-changing. $200,000 for 3 months of work. I'd been smart about the money, investing it, saving it, watching it grow. But more importantly, I'd been watching my parents' situation deteriorate. Every passive-aggressive comment about my worthless education, every dismissive remark about my computer games, every time they made me feel like a financial drain on the family, I was quietly building the power to prove them wrong. The mortgage purchase wasn't revenge, it was justice. It was the natural consequence of underestimating someone.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
For so long that you forget they're capable of anything. Michael finally found his voice. Maya, this is crazy. You can't just buy someone's house out from under them. Actually, I can, I replied, pulling out another document. It's all perfectly legal. When homeowners default on their mortgage, the lending institution has the right to sell that debt to recover their losses. I simply made them an offer they couldn't refuse. But why? Jessica asked, and for the first time in years, she looked at me like I was a real person instead of a piece of furniture. Why would you do this to us? The question hung in the air between us. Why would I do this to my family? The family that had made me feel unwanted, unwelcome, and unworthy for as long as I could remember. The family that had just publicly humiliated me on what should have been one of the proudest days of my life. Do you want to know who I really am? I asked, my voice steady and clear. My name is Maya Thompson, and I want you to understand something. Being underestimated isn't always a disadvantage. Sometimes it's the perfect disguise. I looked at each of them, these people who shared my DNA but had never really known me. For 22 years, you've treated me like I was broken, like I was the mistake that ruined your perfect family dynamic. You made me feel invisible, insignificant, like my thoughts and feelings and achievements didn't matter. The parking lot was almost empty now, just our family, and the weight of 2 decades of dysfunction hanging between us like a toxic cloud. When I was 8 years old, I won the county science fair with a project about solar energy. Do you remember that, Mom? Dad, I came home so excited to tell you, and you were fighting about money. You told me to be quiet, because adults were talking. Jessica had gotten a B+ on a spelling test that same day, and you took her out for ice cream. My first place trophy sat on the kitchen counter for 3 weeks before I finally put it in my room. My mother's face was flushing red, whether from embarrassment or anger, I couldn't tell. That's not how it happened. That's exactly how it happened, I continued. When I was 12, I taught myself to code because I was bored and lonely. You thought it was weird, antisocial. You made me feel like there was something wrong with me for preferring computers to people. But maybe I preferred computers because computers didn't make me feel worthless. My father tried to interrupt, but I held up my hand. For once in my life, he was going to listen to what I had to say. In high school, I started a small tech repair business. Kids would bring me their broken phones, laptops, gaming systems. I was making decent money, enough to buy my own clothes, my own school supplies, even help with groceries sometimes. But it was never enough for you. It wasn't traditional enough, it wasn't what normal kids did. I paused, letting the weight of those memories settle between us. You know what normal kids did. Normal kids had parents who supported their interests, who celebrated their successes, who made them feel valued and loved. Normal kids didn't have to prove their worth every single day just to earn basic respect. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Soon it would be dark, and this surreal conversation would end, but the consequences would stretch far beyond tonight. College was supposed to be my fresh start, I said. A place where I could finally be around people who understood that intelligence and ambition weren't character flaws, and it was. My professors respected me. My classmates valued my contributions. For 4 years, I got to experience what it felt like to matter. I gestured toward the building behind us, toward the auditorium, where hundreds of families had just celebrated their children's achievements. But every time I came home, every holiday break, every summer, I was reminded that in your eyes, I was still just the weird kid who spent too much time on computers. Still the burden, still the disappointment. My voice was getting stronger now, more confident. This wasn't anger talking anymore. This was truth. So I made a decision: if you were going to see me as a burden, I would become the kind of burden that gets your attention. If you were going to dismiss my work as worthless, I would make it worth more than anything you could imagine. And if you were going to treat me like I didn't belong in this family, I would make sure you understood just how much you needed me. Jessica was crying now, quiet tears that she kept wiping away with the back of her hand. Michael looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. But my parents looked stunned, like they were seeing me clearly for the first time in their lives. The mortgage company was happy to work with me, I continued. When I explained that I was a software engineer with a proven income stream and liquid assets, they practically fell over themselves to make the deal happen. Your house, the one you've lived in for 15 years, the one where you raised your children and built your life, it belongs to me now. My father's voice was barely a whisper. What do you want from us? It was a fair question. What did I want? Revenge? An apology? Some kind of acknowledgement that they'd been wrong about me all these years? I want you to understand, I said finally. I want you to understand that the daughter you've been dismissing, the child you've been treating like a burden, just became your landlord. I want you to understand that all those years you spent telling me I was worthless, I was building something valuable. I want you to understand that love and respect aren't things you can take back once you've destroyed them. The parking lot was empty now, except for us. Security lights were starting to flicker on, creating pools of artificial daylight in the growing darkness. You have 30 days, I said, folding the documents back into my purse. That's the standard notice period. After that, you'll need to find somewhere else to live, or we can discuss a rental agreement. But either way, the dynamic has changed. I'm not your burden anymore, you're not my family anymore, we're just people with a business relationship. I turned to walk away, toward my own car parked several rows over, but my mother's voice stopped me. Maya, wait. Her voice was different now, smaller, less certain. We can talk about this, we can work something out. I turned back to face them one last time, these 4 people who had shaped my life in ways both terrible and wonderful. They'd made me strong through their neglect, independent through their dismissal, successful through their doubt. No, Mom, I said quietly. We can't work this out. This isn't a misunderstanding or a family fight that we can fix with a conversation. This is the natural consequence of 22 years of choices. Your choices. And with that, I walked away. Behind me, I could hear the beginning of what would probably be the most difficult conversation my family had ever had. But it was their conversation now, about their future, in what used to be their house. As I drove home to my apartment, the diploma on my passenger seat catching the streetlight, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Not happiness, exactly, and not satisfaction, something deeper and more complex. I felt free. Tomorrow, they would start to understand what I'd been trying to tell them for years. That underestimating someone doesn't make them weak, it just means you won't see them coming when they finally decide to show you exactly how strong they really are. The burden had finally shifted. And it felt lighter than I'd ever imagined it could. The drive home that night felt surreal, like I was floating through a dream where everything familiar had suddenly become foreign. My apartment, a modest one-bedroom place near campus that I'd furnished with second-hand finds and IKEA basics, felt like a sanctuary after the emotional battlefield of the parking lot. I set my diploma on the kitchen counter next to my laptop, two symbols of completely different worlds that somehow belong to the same person. My phone had been buzzing non-stop since I left the university. Text after text from Jessica, missed calls from Michael, even a few attempts from my mother. I let them all go to voicemail. For 22 years, they'd made it clear that my voice didn't matter in family conversations. Now they could experience what it felt like to be ignored. I poured myself a glass of wine, the good bottle I'd been saving for graduation day, and settled onto my couch with my laptop. There were emails to answer, client projects to review, and most importantly, legal documents to finalize. The mortgage transfer wouldn't be complete for another week, but the preliminary paperwork needed my signature tonight. As I scrolled through the purchase agreement, I couldn't help but think about how we'd arrived at this moment. It wasn't like I'd woken up one morning and decided to destroy my family's financial security out of spite. This had been building for years, layer upon layer of dismissal and disrespect, until the foundation of our relationship had cracked beyond repair. Growing up in the Thompson household meant learning to navigate a complex ecosystem of favoritism and neglect. Jessica, 3 years older than me, had always been the golden child, beautiful, social, naturally charismatic in ways that came effortlessly to her. She played volleyball in high school, dated the quarterback, got elected to student council without really trying. Everything she touched seemed to turn to social gold, and my parents ate it up. Michael, 2 years my senior, was the practical one, the son who would carry on my father's construction business. Even as a kid, he could look at a broken fence or a leaky pipe and instinctively understand how to fix it. My father would take him to job sites on weekends, teaching him about measurements and materials, talking about the day when Thompson Construction would become Thompson & Son. Then there was me, the accidental third child, who didn't fit into any of the predetermined slots my parents had created for their offspring. I wasn't beautiful like Jessica, wasn't mechanically inclined like Michael. I was the quiet one who preferred books to people, who would rather spend Saturday afternoons taking apart old electronics than playing outside with neighborhood kids. My earliest memory of feeling like an outsider in my own family centered around a Christmas morning when I was 7 years old. Jessica had asked for a new bike, something pink and sparkly, with streamers hanging from the handlebars. Michael had wanted a tool set, a junior version of the ones my father used for work. Both of them got exactly what they'd requested, plus extra gifts that showed my parents had really listened to their interests. I had asked for a computer, not a gaming system or a tablet, but an actual computer where I could learn to type and maybe figure out how those educational programs at school actually worked. Instead, I unwrapped a baby doll with a collection of tiny outfits and accessories. When I asked about the computer, my mother laughed and said, "Honey, you're too young for something like that. maybe when you're older. But Jessica wasn't too young for a bike that cost 3 times as much as the basic computer I'd researched and specifically requested. Michael wasn't too young for real tools that could actually hurt him if used incorrectly. I was just too different, too incomprehensible for parents who measured their children's worth by how well they fit into traditional expectations. School became my refuge, the place where being different wasn't necessarily a disadvantage. I excelled in math and science, devoured every book in the library, and discovered that teachers actually appreciated students who asked thoughtful questions and turned in work early. But when I brought home report cards full of A's, the response was always lukewarm praise, followed by immediate pivoting to whatever Jessica or Michael had accomplished that week. The pattern continued through middle school and into high school. I joined the academic decathlon team and helped our school win regional competitions. I started a computer club that grew from 5 members to 20 in a single semester. I tutored struggling classmates in math and science, earning money that I saved diligently in a bank account my parents rarely asked about. Meanwhile, Jessica's B average in regular classes was celebrated like academic brilliance, and Michael's decent performance on the JV football team earned him constant praise and attention. It wasn't that my siblings were underachieving, they were normal teenagers doing normal teenager things, at normal teenager levels, but somehow, normal was enough for them while exceptional wasn't enough for me. The summer before my junior year of high school, I made a decision that would change the trajectory of my life, though I didn't realize it at the time. Mrs. Patterson, my computer science teacher, mentioned that a local small business owner was looking for someone to help update their website and manage their social media presence. It wasn't glamorous work, mostly data entry and basic design updates, but it paid $12 an hour, and I could do most of it from home. My parents' reaction was predictably dismissive. My father called it playing on the computer for pocket change and suggested I get a real job, like Jessica's position at the mall clothing store. My mother worried that spending even more time on computers would make me even more antisocial than you already are. But they didn't forbid it, probably because $12 an hour meant I'd stop asking them for money for school supplies and social activities. What started as basic website maintenance quickly evolved into something more complex and lucrative. The business owner, Mr. Hayes, was impressed with my work ethic and technical aptitude. Within 3 months, he'd introduced me to 2 other small business owners who needed similar services. By Christmas, I was managing digital marketing for 5 different local companies and earning more money than Jessica made working twice as many hours at the mall. More importantly, I was learning skills that went far beyond basic computer literacy. I taught myself graphic design, studied search engine optimization, figured out how to create e-commerce platforms that actually converted browsers into customers. Every project was a puzzle to solve, a problem that required creativity and technical knowledge to address effectively. My parents remained blissfully unaware of how much money I was actually making or how sophisticated my work had become. When they asked about my computer job, I'd give vague answers about helping businesses with their websites. They'd nod politely and change the subject to something more interesting, like Jessica's latest boyfriend or Michael's performance in whatever sport he was playing that season. Senior year brought college applications and the first real family conflict about my future. I wanted to study computer science at Oregon State, a program with an excellent reputation and strong industry connections. My parents wanted me to consider something more practical and social, like business administration or communications. They worried that a computer science degree would pigeonhole me into a career working alone in a windowless office, never interacting with real people. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were worried about me being isolated and antisocial, while simultaneously making me feel isolated and unwelcome in my own family. They wanted me to choose a career path that would force me to be more like Jessica, more conventionally social and traditionally feminine, without any consideration for what actually interested me or where my natural talents lay. I applied to Oregon State anyway, along with several backup schools, and was accepted into the computer science program with a partial academic scholarship. My parents agreed to help with the remaining costs, but not without making it clear that they considered it money poorly spent. 4 years and $60,000, so you can play video games for a living, my father said more than once. College was a revelation. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who understood that intelligence and technical aptitude were assets, not liabilities. My professors didn't think it was weird that I preferred coding to partying. My classmates didn't find it antisocial that I'd rather spend Friday night working on a challenging programming project than going to yet another boring house party. More importantly, the work I'd been doing throughout high school suddenly made sense in a broader context. Those website design projects weren't just playing on the computer, they were real business solutions that required understanding of user experience, database management, security protocols, and market analysis. I wasn't just technically proficient, I was developing business acumen and entrepreneurial instincts that most of my classmates wouldn't acquire until years after graduation. By sophomore year, I'd expanded my freelance business to include mobile app development and custom software solutions for mid-sized companies. The work was more complex, the deadlines more demanding, but the financial rewards were substantial. I was earning enough to cover all my college expenses without taking out student loans, something my parents never fully grasped or appreciated. The disconnect between my academic and professional success and my family's perception of my worth became more pronounced with each passing semester. When I made Dean's List, they mentioned it briefly, before launching into detailed discussions about Jessica's new marketing job or Michael's promotion to assistant manager at the sporting goods store, where he worked part-time. When I landed my first major software development contract, worth more money than my father made in 6 months of construction work, they listened politely and then asked if I was sure I was making smart financial decisions. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket, my mother warned, apparently unaware that I'd diversified my client base across multiple industries and revenue streams. The pattern of dismissal and misunderstanding continued through junior year and into senior year. I'd call home with news about academic achievements, professional successes, or exciting opportunities, only to be met with lukewarm responses and immediate subject changes. Meanwhile, Jessica's mundane updates about her entry-level marketing position and Michael's plans to eventually take over the family construction business were treated like front-page news. It wasn't until spring semester of senior year that I fully understood how precarious my parents' financial situation had become. I'd come home for spring break, expecting the usual awkward family dynamics and passive-aggressive comments about my career choices. Instead, I walked into a house filled with tension and whispered conversations that stopped abruptly whenever I entered a room. The first clue was the stack of mail on the kitchen counter, letters marked "You are Gent," and final notice in red lettering. My parents tried to shuffle them out of sight when they noticed me looking, but I'd already seen enough to understand that these weren't routine bills or promotional materials. These were warnings from creditors, notices from utility companies, communication from their mortgage lender about missed payments. The second clue was my parents' behavior toward each other. The easy camaraderie that had characterized their relationship throughout my childhood had been replaced by tense exchanges and careful conversations. They spoke to each other like diplomats from hostile nations, polite on the surface, but clearly navigating some kind of underlying conflict. The third clue was the condition of the house itself. Maintenance, that should have been routine, had been deferred. The roof had a small leak that was being managed with strategically placed buckets. The fence in the backyard was sagging in places where posts had begun to rot. The driveway had cracks that were expanding with each freeze-thaw cycle. For a man whose livelihood depended on construction and home maintenance, my father's willingness to let his own property deteriorate was a clear sign that money was tight, very tight. I didn't ask direct questions, partly because I knew they wouldn't give me honest answers, and partly because I wasn't sure I wanted to know how bad things really were. But I started paying attention to details I'd previously ignored. phone calls that ended abruptly when I walked into rooms, credit card statements left accidentally visible on tables, conversations between my parents that stopped mid-sentence when they realized I was within earshot. By the end of spring break, I had a pretty clear picture of the situation. Thompson Construction had been struggling for several years, hit hard by the economic downturn and increased competition from larger companies with better resources and more competitive pricing. My parents had been using credit cards to cover business expenses and home mortgage payments, creating a spiral of debt that was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. The responsible thing would have been to offer help. I had money saved, more than they probably realized. I could have quietly paid off some of their debt or helped them restructure their finances in ways that would have bought them time to turn the business around. The old Maya, the one who still believed that love and loyalty could overcome years of neglect and dismissal, probably would have done exactly that, but something had shifted in me during those college years. Maybe it was the confidence that came from academic and professional success. Maybe it was the perspective that came from being around people who valued intelligence and ambition. Or maybe it was just the accumulated weight of 21 years of being treated like a burden and a disappointment by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. Instead of offering help, I started doing research. I looked into Oregon property law, studied mortgage transfer procedures, researched how debt sales worked in practical terms. I wasn't planning anything specific. I was just gathering information, understanding the landscape, preparing for possibilities I couldn't yet articulate. The information I discovered was illuminating. When homeowners fall behind on mortgage payments, lending institutions have several options for recovering their losses. They can initiate foreclosure proceedings, which is time-consuming and expensive. They can work with borrowers to restructure payment terms, which doesn't always result in full recovery. Or they can sell the mortgage debt to a third party, often at a significant discount, and let someone else deal with the collection process. For someone with sufficient liquid assets and good credit, purchasing mortgage debt could be a straightforward transaction. The lending institution gets immediate partial recovery of their losses. The new debt holder gets a secured asset backed by real property, and the original borrowers, well, they get new landlords, essentially. I filed this information away and focused on finishing my senior year. I had thesis requirements to complete, job interviews to attend, and a major software development project that was consuming most of my free time. The Seattle startup contract was the biggest opportunity I'd ever landed, both financially and professionally. If I could deliver what they needed on schedule and within budget, it would establish my reputation in the industry and provide the financial foundation for whatever came next. The work was brutally demanding. 18-hour days were routine. I lived on coffee and takeout, barely sleeping, completely absorbed in the complex problem-solving that the project required. But it was also exhilarating in ways that nothing else had ever been. This wasn't academic work with artificial deadlines and theoretical applications. This was real-world problem-solving with immediate practical implications and substantial financial stakes. When I finally delivered the completed system, 3 days ahead of schedule and functioning better than the client had expected, the feeling of accomplishment was unlike anything I'd experienced before. This wasn't a grade on a test or recognition from a professor. This was professional validation from people who understood exactly how difficult the work had been and how well I'd executed it. The financial reward was equally satisfying. $200,000 deposited into my business account, more money than most people my age see in 5 years. But more important than the money was the proof of concept. I wasn't just technically proficient, I was capable of delivering complex solutions to sophisticated clients under demanding conditions. I was ready for whatever challenges the professional world might throw at me. Graduation day was supposed to be the culmination of 4 years of hard work and the beginning of an exciting new chapter. I'd been looking forward to sharing this achievement with my family, hoping that maybe, finally, they would understand that my unconventional path had led somewhere valuable. Instead, graduation day became the final confirmation that no amount of success would ever be enough to earn their respect or appreciation. Standing in that parking lot, hearing my father call me a burden on what should have been one of the proudest days of my life, I realized that I'd been waiting for something that was never going to come. But I wasn't the same person who had left for college 4 years earlier. I wasn't the quiet, uncertain girl who absorbed criticism and dismissal without fighting back. I was someone who had built something valuable, someone who understood her own worth regardless of whether her family recognized it. And I was someone who had $200,000 in the bank, excellent credit, and detailed knowledge of exactly how vulnerable my parents' financial situation really was. The next morning, I called Cascade Home Lending and asked to speak with someone about purchasing distressed mortgage debt. The conversation was surprisingly straightforward. Yes, they were interested in selling. Yes, my financial profile made me a qualified buyer. No, there wouldn't be any complications as long as I could provide proof of funds and complete the transaction within their required time frame. The amount they quoted was less than I'd expected. $750,000 for a mortgage that had originally been worth over $1 million. My parents' financial struggles had created an opportunity, and my years of professional success had given me the resources to take advantage of it. I didn't hesitate. This wasn't about revenge or cruelty. This was about finally, definitively, establishing a relationship dynamic based on reality rather than their outdated perceptions of who I was and what I was capable of. 5 days later, the paperwork was complete. Maya Thompson, the family burden, had become Maya Thompson, mortgage holder. The girl they'd dismissed as antisocial and impractical now owned the roof over their heads. It would take them a week to understand what had happened. It would take them much longer to understand why. The week following graduation passed in a strange bubble of normalcy and anticipation. I went through the motions of my regular routine, answering client emails, reviewing project timelines, preparing for my upcoming move to Austin, where I'd accepted a senior developer position with a rapidly growing fintech company. But underneath the surface calm, I was acutely aware that everything was about to change for my family in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. My phone continued buzzing with increasingly frantic messages from Jessica and Michael. At first, their texts were confused and conciliatory, asking if we could talk things through and suggesting that maybe I'd acted impulsively after an emotional day. When I didn't respond, the tone shifted to frustration and then to something approaching panic as they began to realize I was serious about the mortgage purchase. My parents, true to form, remained silent. No calls, no texts, no attempts to reach out directly. I suspect they were hoping this was some kind of elaborate bluff, a dramatic gesture designed to get their attention that would eventually blow over if they just waited it out. They'd spent so many years dismissing my thoughts and feelings that they probably couldn't imagine I was capable of following through on something this significant. On Wednesday morning, exactly 1 week after graduation, the registered letters arrived at their house. I knew because I'd specifically requested delivery confirmation from the law firm handling the mortgage transfer. 3 identical envelopes, one addressed to Robert Thompson, one to Linda Thompson, and one marked for all adult residents, as required by Oregon state law. The letters were formal, professional, and absolutely clear about what had transpired. Cascade Home Lending had sold the mortgage debt associated with 1247 Maple Street to Thompson Holdings LLC, a limited liability company, registered in Oregon, and owned by Maya Elizabeth Thompson. Effective immediately, all mortgage payments should be directed to the new servicer, and any questions about the account should be addressed through the contact information provided. More importantly, the letters included a formal notice that the property was currently in default due to 6 months of missed payments, and that the new mortgage holder was exercising their right to demand immediate payment of all outstanding amounts, or alternatively, to begin foreclosure proceedings within 30 days as permitted under Oregon revised statutes. However, the letters also included an unexpected option. The new mortgage holder was prepared to discuss alternative arrangements, including the possibility of converting the current residents to tenants under a month-to-month rental agreement, provided all parties could reach mutually acceptable terms within the required notice period. I'd spent considerable time crafting that language with my attorney. It was important that the legal notice be absolutely clear about my rights as the new mortgage holder, but I also wanted to leave room for negotiation if my family was willing to acknowledge the new reality and treat me with the respect I'd never received as their daughter. The response came faster than I'd anticipated. My phone rang at 2:47 p.m. on Wednesday afternoon, less than 6 hours after the letters would have been delivered. The caller ID showed my mother's number, but when I answered, it was my father's voice on the other end, rough and strained in a way I'd never heard before. Maya, he said my name like it was a foreign word he was struggling to pronounce correctly. We need to talk. I was sitting in my apartment, working on final preparations for my move to Austin, surrounded by boxes and packing materials. Through my window, I could see students walking across campus, most of them probably heading to summer jobs or internships, blissfully unaware that their family relationships weren't complicated battlefields requiring legal documentation to navigate. "Hello, Dad," I said, keeping my voice neutral and professional. "Did you receive the information from my attorney?" There was a long pause, the kind of silence that stretches until it becomes its own form of communication. I could hear voices in the background, probably my mother and siblings discussing strategy for this conversation they clearly hadn't wanted to have. "This is insane, Maya. You can't seriously think we're going to let you kick us out of our own house." The phrasing was interesting. Not your childhood home, or the family house, but our own house. Even now, even after receiving legal documentation that proved otherwise, he was still thinking in terms of ownership and control that no longer reflected reality. "It's not your house anymore, Dad. The mortgage documents I received from Cascade make that very clear.
Yep.
You stopped making payments 6 months ago. The property has been in default longer than that. Cascade had every right to sell the debt, and I had every right to buy it. But you're our daughter." My mother's voice now, apparently she'd taken the phone, or they'd switched to speaker. "Families don't do this to each other. This isn't how normal people handle disagreements." The irony was so thick I almost laughed out loud. For 22 years, they'd made it abundantly clear that I wasn't a normal member of this family. I was the burden, the disappointment, the child who required constant corrections and criticism. But now, suddenly when I was holding cards they needed, family loyalty was supposed to matter. "You're right, Mom. Families don't usually do this to each other. Families usually support their children's achievements, they celebrate graduations, they show interest in their children's careers and ambitions. They don't call their children burdens on what's supposed to be one of the proudest days of their lives." Another long silence. I could picture them in their kitchen, probably sitting around the same table where I'd done homework, while they discussed Jessica's social life and Michael's sports achievements, trying to figure out how their powerless youngest child had suddenly become the person controlling their housing situation. "Look," my father said finally, his voice taking on the reasonable tone he used when he was trying to close a difficult business deal. "Maybe we said some things we shouldn't have said. Graduation was stressful for everyone. There's been a lot of financial pressure lately, and sometimes that makes people say things they don't really mean." It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever heard from either of my parents, but it was also carefully worded to avoid accepting any real responsibility. The graduation comments were just things that were said, not reflections of deeply held beliefs. The financial pressure was an external force that had somehow caused temporary personality changes, not a situation they'd created through poor business decisions and unrealistic spending. "Dad, this isn't about one bad day or a few unfortunate comments. This is about 22 years of being treated like I don't matter. 22 years of having my achievements dismissed, my interests mocked, my contributions to this family minimized or ignored entirely." "That's not true." Jessica's voice now. Apparently, the whole family was gathered for this conversation. We've always been proud of you. Maybe we didn't always show it the right way, but we love you. We're family. The word family kept coming up in this conversation, like a magic incantation they thought would somehow undo the legal reality of the mortgage transfer. As if saying we're family enough times would make me forget about all the times they'd made me feel like I didn't really belong to this family at all. Jessica, when was the last time you asked me about my work? Not just polite small talk, but actually showed interest in what I do for a living. Silence. When was the last time either of you called me to see how I was doing, just because you were thinking about me and wanted to hear my voice? More silence. When was the last time any of you treated me like my thoughts and opinions mattered as much as everyone else's in this family? The silence stretched so long, I started to wonder if the call had been dropped. Finally, Michael spoke up, his voice quieter than the others. Maya, we know we haven't been perfect, but this seems really extreme. There has to be a better way to work through family problems than buying someone's mortgage. You're right, Michael. There are lots of better ways to work through family problems. We could have had honest conversations about feelings and expectations. We could have gone to family therapy. We could have made genuine efforts to understand and respect each other's differences. But none of those things can happen when one person in the family is consistently treated like their feelings don't matter. I stood up and walked to my window, looking out at the campus where I'd spent 4 years becoming the person I was today. In a few weeks, I'd be living in a different state, working with people who valued my skills and treated me like a professional equal. I'd be starting a new chapter of my life where my worth wasn't constantly questioned or diminished. Here's what's going to happen, I continued, my voice steady and clear. You have 30 days to decide how you want to handle this situation. You can find somewhere else to live, which I understand will be difficult given your current financial situation, or you can stay in the house as my tenants, paying market rate rent on a month-to-month lease. Tenants, my father's voice cracked on the word. You want us to pay rent to live in our own house? It's not your house anymore, Dad. That's what you seem to be having trouble understanding. The house belongs to me now. If you want to continue living there, you'll need to pay rent, like any other tenant. If you can't afford market rate rent, we can discuss a payment plan or reduced rate based on your actual financial capabilities. What I didn't say, but what I think they were beginning to understand, was that this arrangement would require them to treat me with basic respect and courtesy. Landlords don't generally tolerate tenants who call them burdens or dismiss their professional achievements. Tenants who want to maintain good relationships with their landlords usually make an effort to be polite and appreciative. This is blackmail, my mother said, but her voice lacked conviction. You're using our financial problems to force us to treat you differently. No, Mom. I'm using my financial success to establish a relationship dynamic based on mutual respect instead of one-sided obligation. For 22 years, I've been the family member who was expected to absorb criticism without defending myself, to provide help without receiving appreciation, to accept being treated poorly because blood relationships were supposed to override basic human decency. I paused, letting that sink in for a moment. Now I'm the family member who owns your house. If you want to maintain a relationship with me, personal or professional, you'll need to figure out how to treat me like someone whose feelings and opinions actually matter. If you can't do that, you're welcome to find housing elsewhere, and we can limit our contact to birthday cards and holiday greetings. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but it was mostly circular. They wanted to know if there was some way to undo the mortgage purchase. There wasn't. They wanted to know if I would consider selling the house back to them. I wouldn't, at least not at the discounted price they'd be able to afford. They wanted to know what I really wanted from this situation, as if there was some secret demand I hadn't articulated that would make everything go back to the way it was before. What I really wanted was something they couldn't give me, because it involved changing the past. I wanted a childhood where my achievements had been celebrated instead of minimized. I wanted parents who had shown interest in my thoughts and feelings instead of treating me like an inconvenient obligation. I wanted siblings who had defended me when I was being criticized instead of staying silent or joining in the mockery. Since I couldn't have any of those things, I settled for something more practical, a future where my family treated me with the same basic respect they would show to any other competent adult who had something they needed. The call ended without any resolution, which was exactly what I'd expected. My family needed time to process this new reality, to understand that their youngest daughter wasn't the powerless child they'd been dismissing for over 2 decades. They needed to grapple with the fact that the person they'd always seen as dependent and needy was now the person controlling their housing security. Over the next few days, I received several more calls and numerous text messages. Jessica tried the emotional manipulation approach, sending long messages about family bonds and forgiveness. Michael attempted rational negotiation, suggesting various compromise solutions that would allow them to maintain ownership while addressing my concerns about respect and appreciation. My parents mostly stayed silent, probably hoping that one of their other children would find a way to fix this problem without requiring them to acknowledge any wrongdoing. None of these approaches worked, partly because I'd anticipated them, and partly because they all assumed I was still the same person who had left for college 4 years earlier. They were trying to manage a family crisis using strategies that had worked when I was 17 and desperate for their approval. But I wasn't 17 anymore, and I definitely wasn't desperate for their approval. On Friday evening, exactly 1 week after the legal notices had been delivered, I got a text from Michael asking if I would meet him for coffee on Saturday morning. Not the whole family, just him. He wanted to talk one-on-one about finding a solution that would work for everyone. I agreed, curious to see if Michael had anything more substantial to offer than the emotional appeals and logical arguments that had characterized our earlier conversations. We met at a coffee shop near campus, a place where I'd spent countless hours studying and working on projects during my college years. Michael looked exhausted, like he'd been losing sleep over this situation. He ordered a large coffee with extra shots and sat across from me in a booth near the back of the shop, away from other customers who might overhear our conversation. "Maya, I need you to help me understand what you're thinking," he said without any preamble. "This whole thing feels like it came out of nowhere. One day we're a normal family with normal problems, and the next day you own our house, and we're supposed to pay you rent. How did we get here?" It was a fair question, and I appreciated that he was asking it directly instead of dancing around the issue like everyone else had been doing. Michael had always been the most straightforward member of our family, the one least likely to engage in emotional manipulation or passive-aggressive behavior. "We got here because normal families don't call their children burdens on graduation day," I said. "We got here because normal families don't spend 22 years making one child feel like their thoughts and achievements don't matter. We got here because I finally got tired of waiting for you all to treat me like I was actually part of this family." Michael nodded slowly, stirring his coffee even though he hadn't added anything to it. "I know we haven't always been great at showing appreciation. Mom and Dad have their own way of dealing with things, and sometimes that means they don't express emotions the way other people do. But buying our house seems like a pretty extreme response to family communication problems. Michael, do you remember my 8th grade science fair project?" He looked confused by the apparent change of subject. Not specifically. You did a lot of science fair projects. I built a working solar panel array and used it to power a small irrigation system for Mom's vegetable garden. I spent 3 months researching photovoltaic technology, designing the system, sourcing components, and testing different configurations. The project won first place at the county level and qualified for the state competition. I paused, watching his face to see if any of this was registering as familiar. "The same week that I won the county science fair, you made varsity JV basketball." "Not varsity, JV varsity." "Do you remember how our parents reacted to those 2 pieces of news?" Michael's face was starting to show recognition, and also something that might have been discomfort. Dad took you out to celebrate making the team. Mom called all her friends to brag about your athletic achievement. They put a picture of you in your uniform on the refrigerator, and it stayed there for 2 years. My first place trophy went on a shelf in my bedroom, and when I asked if we could celebrate my win, Mom said she was too tired from work to plan anything special. Maya, I didn't know. Of course you didn't know, because you were 13 years old and focused on your own life, which is completely normal for a 13-year-old. But Mom and Dad did know. They made a conscious choice about which child's achievement was worth celebrating and which child's achievement was just something that happened. I could see that he was starting to understand the broader pattern, not just isolated incidents, but a systematic difference in how our achievements and setbacks were handled throughout our childhood. This isn't about one bad day or poor communication skills, Michael. This is about 2 decades of conscious choices our parents made about which children mattered and which child was just taking up space in the family dynamic. Michael was quiet for a long time, processing what I'd said. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than it had been before. I think I always knew you were treated differently. I just never thought about how that must have felt from your perspective, and I definitely never imagined you were keeping track of all those incidents, or that they were building up to something like this. I wasn't keeping track intentionally, but when you spend your entire childhood feeling like you don't really belong in your own family, you tend to notice the patterns, and when you finally have the resources to change the dynamic, you start thinking about whether you want to keep accepting a relationship that makes you feel worthless. So what happens now? Do you really want us to pay you rent to live in the house where we all grew up? It was the first time anyone in my family had asked me directly what I wanted, rather than assuming they knew, or trying to convince me that what I wanted was unreasonable. What I want is a relationship where my thoughts and feelings matter as much as everyone else. What I want is a family that treats my achievements with the same enthusiasm they show for Jessica's job promotions or your business plans. What I want is parents who are interested in my life and proud of my success, instead of dismissive and critical. I leaned forward, making sure he was really listening. If we can have that kind of relationship, then maybe we can work out a housing arrangement that feels fair to everyone. But if Mom and Dad can't figure out how to treat me with basic respect and appreciation, then yes, I want them to pay market rate rent to live in my house until they can find somewhere else to go. Michael nodded, understanding finally beginning to show in his expression. And if they can't afford market rate rent, then they'll need to figure out a living situation they can afford, just like every other family that experienced financial difficulties. The harshness of that statement hung between us for a moment. I wasn't being cruel for the sake of cruelty, but I also wasn't going to provide financial support to people who had spent 22 years making me feel unwanted and unappreciated. Maya, is there any way to undo this? To transfer the house back to them, not at the price they could afford to pay. I paid $750,000 for a property that's worth over $1 million. If they want to buy it back, they'll need to pay fair market value, which they can't do. We sat in silence for a while, both of us understanding that we'd reached the heart of the matter. My parents had created a financial crisis through poor business decisions and unrealistic spending. They'd also created a family relationship crisis through 22 years of emotional neglect and dismissal. Now both crises were converging in a way that gave me all the power and left them with very few options. What would a rental arrangement look like? Michael asked finally. Standard lease terms, market rate rent, paid monthly in advance, security deposit, basic tenant responsibilities for maintenance and upkeep, landlord rights for property inspection and improvement decisions, and the family relationship part. That would depend on whether Mom and Dad can figure out how to treat me like an adult whose opinions and achievements matter. If they can do that, then we might be able to rebuild some kind of functional family dynamic. If they can't, then we'll have a business relationship and nothing more. Michael finished his coffee and sat back in his chair, looking like he was trying to process information that didn't fit into any of his previous understanding of family relationships. "I'll talk to them," he said finally. "I can't promise they'll suddenly become different people, but I think they're starting to understand that you're not the same person who left for college 4 years ago. No, I'm not, and I'm never going to be that person again." As we left the coffee shop, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope that maybe, possibly, my family might actually be capable of growth and change. It was a small hope, tempered by decades of disappointment, but it was something. Whether that hope would prove justified would depend entirely on choices my parents hadn't yet proven they were capable of making. 3 weeks had passed since my conversation with Michael at the coffee shop, and the 30-day notice period was rapidly approaching its end. During that time, I'd received exactly 2 phone calls from my parents and a handful of text messages that ranged from pleading to angry to resigned. The silence between communications spoke volumes about their struggle to accept the new reality of our relationship. My move to Austin had proceeded on schedule, despite the family drama unfolding back in Oregon. The fintech company had provided a generous relocation package, and I'd found a beautiful apartment in South Austin with exposed brick walls, high ceilings, and a home office setup that would make any software developer envious. For the first time in my adult life, I was living somewhere that felt entirely mine, decorated according to my tastes, furnished with pieces I'd chosen because I liked them rather than because they were affordable. The work was challenging and rewarding in ways that validated every choice I'd made about my career path. My new colleagues treated me like the experienced professional I'd become, seeking my input on complex technical problems and respecting my opinions in strategy meetings. It was a stark contrast to family dinners where my voice was typically ignored or dismissed as soon as I started speaking. On a Thursday evening, as I was reviewing code for a particularly complex security protocol, my phone rang with a call from Jessica. We hadn't spoken since the day after graduation, and I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer, perhaps curiosity about whether she'd developed any new strategies for managing this situation. "Maya, thank God you answered." Her voice sounded strained, exhausted in a way that reminded me of finals week during college. "We need to talk, all of us, as a family, Jessica. We've already talked, multiple times. The situation hasn't changed, but it could change. Mom and Dad want to make things right. They've been talking to a counselor, trying to understand how we got to this point. They want to apologize properly and see if we can work something out." I set down my laptop and walked to the window of my apartment, looking out at the Austin skyline as the sun set behind the downtown buildings. The city was vibrant and alive, full of people pursuing their ambitions without having to justify their choices to families who didn't understand them. "What kind of something are we talking about, Jessica?" "They want to stay in the house, obviously. But they understand now that things have to be different. They're willing to pay rent, and they want to have regular family meetings where everyone gets to speak and be heard. They've even talked about family therapy if that's what it takes." It sounded promising, but I'd learned to be skeptical of sudden personality changes in people who'd spent decades behaving in consistent patterns, and what brought about this remarkable transformation in their attitudes. Jessica was quiet for a moment, and I could almost hear her deciding how much truth to share. They talked to a real estate agent about what it would cost to buy a comparable house in today's market, and they looked into rental prices for places that would be big enough for them. The reality of their financial situation is pretty overwhelming. So it wasn't a genuine change of heart about family dynamics. It was a practical recognition that they couldn't afford to lose the house and start over somewhere else. That was useful information, but it didn't address the underlying issues that had led to this situation. "Jessica, do you remember when I was 15 and I started that computer repair business?" "Vaguely." You were always working on something with electronics. I was making about $800 a month fixing computers and phones for people in the neighborhood. That's more than most 15-year-olds make at traditional part-time jobs. But whenever I mentioned the business at family dinners, Mom and Dad would make jokes about my little computer hobby and suggest I get a real job like working at a restaurant or retail store. I remember some of that. They were worried you were spending too much time alone, not developing social skills. They were worried that I was doing something they didn't understand and couldn't control. When Michael started working construction jobs with Dad during summers, that was celebrated as valuable work experience. When you got that internship at the marketing firm, that was treated as a major professional achievement. But when I built a profitable business as a teenager, that was just weird antisocial behavior that needed to be corrected. I could hear Jessica breathing on the other end of the line, probably processing the implications of what I was saying. The pattern continued through college and right up until graduation day. My achievements were minimized, my interests were mocked, and my contributions to the family were taken for granted. Now that I own their house, suddenly they want family meetings and therapy sessions. Do you see why I might be skeptical about their motivations? Maya, people can change. Maybe it took something this dramatic to make them realize how they've been treating you. Maybe. Or maybe they're just scared and willing to say whatever they think I want to hear, until they can figure out a way to regain control of the situation. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with Jessica alternating between emotional appeals and practical arguments about why I should give our parents another chance. She wasn't wrong that people could change, and she wasn't wrong that families sometimes needed dramatic wake-up calls to address long-standing dysfunction. But she was asking me to risk my emotional well-being on the possibility that two people in their 50s had suddenly developed empathy and self-awareness they'd never demonstrated before. After we hung up, I spent the evening thinking about what I actually wanted from this situation. The house was an asset, a good investment that would appreciate over time regardless of whether my family lived in it. I could easily find other tenants who would pay market rate rent without the emotional complications of family relationships. From a purely financial perspective, it didn't matter whether my parents stayed or left. But from an emotional perspective, the situation was more complex. Part of me genuinely wanted to have a healthy relationship with my family, one based on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than obligation and resentment. Another part of me was tired of being disappointed by people who seemed incapable of seeing me clearly or treating me fairly. The next morning, I called Michael and told him I was willing to meet with our parents one more time, but only under specific conditions. The meeting would take place at a neutral location, not at the house, or at someone else's home, where the power dynamics might feel skewed. We would each have exactly 15 minutes to speak without interruption, and everyone would commit to listening respectfully, even if they disagreed with what was being said. Most importantly, this would be the final conversation about the housing situation. Whatever decisions emerged from this meeting would be binding. Michael agreed to arrange the meeting and suggested we use a conference room at the community center where he sometimes played basketball. It was public enough to feel safe, but private enough for an honest conversation about family issues that had been decades in the making. We met on a Saturday afternoon, all 5 of us sitting around a table that was probably used for PTA meetings and book clubs most of the time. My parents looked older than I remembered, more fragile somehow, as if the stress of the past month had aged them in ways that normal time hadn't. Jessica and Michael both looked nervous, like they were afraid this conversation might explode into something irreparable. My father spoke first, his voice carefully controlled in a way that suggested he'd rehearsed what he wanted to say. Maya, your mother and I have been doing a lot of thinking about the things you've said over the past few weeks. We've also been talking to someone, a counselor, who's helped us understand that we may not have been the parents you needed us to be. It was a more substantial acknowledgement than I'd expected, though the careful language suggested he was still struggling with the concept of accepting full responsibility. "We want you to know that we're proud of what you've accomplished, your success in college, your career, the business you've built. We may not have understood it, but that doesn't mean it wasn't impressive." My mother nodded, her eyes watery in a way that might have been genuine emotion, or might have been calculated for effect. "We love you, Maya. We've always loved you. We just didn't know how to show it in ways that you could understand." It was my turn to speak, and I'd spent considerable time thinking about what I wanted to say in this moment. "I appreciate that you're trying to make amends. I really do. But love isn't just a feeling that exists in your hearts. Love is actions, behaviors, choices you make about how to treat someone. For 22 years, your actions told me that my thoughts and feelings didn't matter as much as Jessica's or Michael's." I looked directly at each of them as I spoke, making sure they understood I was serious about every word. "You say you've always loved me, but you made me feel invisible in my own family. You say you're proud of my achievements, but you spent years dismissing and minimizing everything I accomplished. You say you want things to be different now, but only after I gain the power to affect your housing security." The room was quiet, except for the sound of air conditioning and distant voices from other activities happening elsewhere in the building. "If you want to stay in the house, here are the terms. You'll pay $1,500 per month in rent, which is below market rate but reflects your current financial capabilities. You'll maintain the property in good condition, and allow me to make necessary improvements as I see fit. Most importantly, you'll treat me with the same respect you would show any other adult who was doing you a significant favor." I paused, making sure they understood the weight of what I was saying. "That means no more dismissive comments about my career or my interests, no more jokes at my expense during family gatherings, no more taking my help for granted or treating my contributions like they're less valuable than everyone else's. If you can't do those things, then you need to find somewhere else to live." My father's face was red, whether from embarrassment or anger I couldn't tell. "Those seem like reasonable terms," he said finally. "And if we agree to this arrangement, what happens to our relationship as a family?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been struggling with myself. "That depends on whether you can actually follow through on treating me differently. If you can, then maybe we can build something better than what we had before. If you can't, then we'll have a business relationship and nothing more." The conversation continued for another hour, working through practical details about lease terms, maintenance responsibilities, and communication protocols. It felt surreal to be negotiating a rental agreement with my own parents, but it was also clarifying in ways that our previous family interactions had never been. 6 months later, the arrangement was working better than I'd expected. My parents were paying rent on time, maintaining the property carefully, and making genuine efforts to treat me like an adult whose opinions mattered. It wasn't perfect. Next decades of ingrained behaviors don't change overnight, but it was progress. More importantly, I'd discovered something I hadn't anticipated. Setting clear boundaries and demanding respect hadn't destroyed our family relationships, it had actually made them healthier. When my parents could no longer take my presence for granted, they started making real efforts to connect with me as a person, rather than just managing me as a problematic family member. Jessica and I had developed a stronger relationship than we'd ever had before. Without the underlying tension of family favoritism, we could actually enjoy each other's company and have conversations about our lives that went beyond surface-level small talk. Michael had started calling regularly just to check in, something he'd never done when we all lived in the same city. My career in Austin was thriving beyond my expectations. The fintech company had promoted me to lead developer within 4 months, and I was working on projects that would have been impossible to imagine during my college years. More importantly, I was working with people who valued my contributions and challenged me to grow professionally in ways that felt exciting rather than stressful. On a warm evening in late summer, As I sat on my apartment balcony, reviewing code and enjoying the Austin sunset, my phone buzzed with a text from my father. Saw an article about your company in the Business Journal today. The reporter mentioned the security protocols you developed. Wanted you to know we're proud of what you're building. It was a small gesture, but it represented something that had never existed in our relationship before: recognition and appreciation offered freely, rather than extracted through dramatic confrontation. I texted back, "Thank you. That means a lot," and it did mean a lot more than I'd expected, not because I needed his approval to feel good about my accomplishments, but because it suggested he was finally learning to see me as someone worth celebrating, rather than someone who needed constant correction. The house in Oregon remained a good investment, appreciating steadily as the Portland housing market continued to grow. My parents were taking better care of it than they had when they owned it, probably because they understood that maintaining good relationships with landlords required more effort than they'd previously invested in property maintenance. But more than the financial benefits, the situation had taught me something valuable about the difference between family relationships based on obligation and family relationships based on choice and respect. For the first time in my adult life, my family members were choosing to maintain relationships with me because they valued my presence, not because they felt stuck with me due to shared DNA. The girl who had walked across that graduation stage 9 months earlier, absorbing her father's cruel words about being a burden, had been replaced by someone who understood her own worth, regardless of whether others recognized it. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. Being underestimated had taught me to estimate myself accurately. Being dismissed had taught me to value my own opinions. Being treated like a burden had taught me to become someone whose support was genuinely valuable rather than desperately given. My name is Linda Thompson, and I learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop waiting for other people to see your worth and start demanding that they treat you according to the value you know you possess. When you own your power instead of apologizing for it, people have two choices. They can learn to respect you, or they can learn to live without you. Either way, you win. On quiet evenings when I'm working from my home office in Austin, surrounded by the life I've built through my own efforts and choices, I sometimes think about that graduation day and the girl who smiled through her humiliation because she thought that was her only option. She was wrong about having only one option, but she was right about one thing: the smile you wore that day was hiding something powerful. She just didn't know yet how powerful it really was. The burden had finally lifted, not because anyone else had decided to carry it, but because I'd finally understood that it had never really belonged to me in the first place. Being different, being ambitious, being successful in unconventional ways, none of those things were burdens. They were advantages, gifts that had been disguised as problems by people who couldn't understand their value. Now I help other young people who are struggling with families that don't understand them, particularly women in tech, who are dealing with relatives who dismiss their career choices or minimize their achievements. Through mentorship programs and speaking engagements, I share the story of how being underestimated became my greatest asset, and how setting boundaries transformed my family relationships from sources of pain into sources of genuine connection. The house in Oregon still stands, still generating rental income, still serving as a reminder that financial independence is one of the most powerful tools for creating healthy relationships. My parents still live there, still learning how to be tenants in a property they once owned, still adjusting to a family dynamic where their youngest daughter's voice carries as much weight as anyone else's. And I still live in Austin, still building software that solves complex problems, still proving every day that the computer science degree my father called a waste of money was actually one of the best investments our family ever made. The only difference is that now everyone knows it. 2 years had passed since that surreal graduation day in the university parking lot, and the woman I'd become barely resembled the person who had smiled through her father's cruel words, while secretly plotting the most dramatic real estate transaction of her life. Austin had become more than just a city where I worked. It had become the place where I finally learned what it felt like to be valued for who I actually was, rather than constantly criticized for who I wasn't. My position at the fintech company had evolved beyond anything I'd imagined when I first accepted the job. What started as a senior developer role had transformed into heading up an entire cybersecurity division, managing a team of 12 brilliant engineers who looked to me for technical guidance and strategic direction. The girl who had once been dismissed as antisocial for preferring computers to people was now leading meetings with Fortune 500 executives and presenting security solutions to boards of directors who hung on every word I said. The irony wasn't lost on me. My parents had spent years worrying that my computer obsession would leave me isolated and professionally limited, unable to function in normal social situations. Instead, my technical expertise had become the foundation for a career that required constant collaboration, complex problem solving, and the kind of high-stakes communication skills that most people never develop. On a particularly busy Thursday afternoon, as I was reviewing security protocols for a major banking client, my assistant knocked on my office door with an expression that suggested something unusual was happening. "Maya, there's someone here to see you. He says he's your brother, but he doesn't have an appointment." Michael stood in my office doorway, looking uncomfortable and out of place, dressed in his best khakis and button-down shirt, like he was attending a job interview. It had been 8 months since we'd last seen each other in person, though we'd maintained regular phone contact as our family relationships had slowly rebuilt themselves around new foundations of mutual respect. "Michael, what are you doing in Austin? Is everything okay at home?" He stepped into my office, his eyes taking in the floor-to-ceiling windows, with their view of the downtown skyline, the awards and certifications on my walls, the high-end technology setup that served as the command for security operations, affecting millions of financial transactions daily. "Everything's fine, better than fine. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something, and I thought it was important enough to do in person, rather than over the phone." I gestured for him to sit in one of the chairs facing my desk, the same chairs where I'd hosted meetings with venture capitalists, government security officials, and technology executives from companies whose names were household words. It felt strange to see my brother in this context, this professional environment that represented everything my family had once dismissed as impractical computer games. "Dad wants to buy the house back." The words hung in the air between us, loaded with implications I was still processing. In the 2 years since I'd purchased their mortgage, my parents had been model tenants, paying rent promptly, maintaining the property meticulously, and slowly learning how to treat me like an adult, whose opinions and achievements mattered. The arrangement had worked so well that I'd almost forgotten it was supposed to be temporary. He's been saving money, cutting expenses, and Thompson Construction has had its best year in a decade. He's got a bank lined up that's willing to finance the purchase at current market value, which means you'd make a significant profit on your investment. I leaned back in my chair, looking out at the Austin afternoon skyline, while I processed this unexpected development. The house had indeed been an excellent investment, appreciating substantially as Portland's real estate market continued its upward trajectory. Selling it back to my parents would provide a considerable return on my initial purchase price, money I could use for other investments, or simply add to my growing portfolio of financial security. What brought this on? Why now? Michael shifted in his chair, choosing his words carefully. "I think he's finally understood that renting from his daughter isn't a temporary inconvenience that's going to go away. He's realized this is the new normal, and he wants to have ownership of his home again. But more than that, I think he wants to prove that he can handle his financial responsibilities without putting the family's housing security at risk." It was a more mature perspective than I'd expected from my father, who had historically struggled with accepting responsibility for the consequences of his financial decisions. The fact that he'd spent 2 years rebuilding his business and saving money instead of looking for shortcuts or asking for family loans suggested genuine growth. He also wanted me to tell you something else. He said that buying the house back isn't about undoing what happened or pretending that everything goes back to the way it was before. He knows that can't happen, and he doesn't want it to happen. He likes the relationship you all have now better than what you had before. That was perhaps the most surprising part of Michael's message. For most of my childhood and adolescence, I'd assumed my parents preferred the old family dynamic, where they had unquestioned authority, and I had no real voice in family decisions. The idea that they might actually prefer a relationship based on mutual respect and clear boundaries was both gratifying and somewhat overwhelming. What about Mom? How does she feel about this? She's the one who suggested it actually. She said she's tired of feeling like a tenant in her own home, but she also said she never wants to go back to taking you for granted. She wants to buy the house back so she can feel like herself again, but she wants to maintain the family relationships you've all built over the past 2 years. The conversation continued for another hour, covering practical details about market valuation, financing arrangements, and timeline considerations. But underneath the business discussion was a more complex emotional negotiation about family relationships, personal growth, and the question of whether people could fundamentally change their behavior patterns after decades of dysfunction. That evening, Michael and I had dinner at one of Austin's celebrated barbecue restaurants, sitting on the patio as the sun set over the city and live music drifted from the stages that made Austin famous. It was the first time we'd spent extended social time together as adults, without the underlying tension of family obligations or the pressure of managing our parents' financial crisis. Maya, can I ask you something? Michael said as we finished our meals and moved on to the local beer selection that had convinced him Austin might be a city worth visiting more often. Of course. Do you ever regret buying the house? Not financially, but emotionally. Do you ever wish you'd handled things differently that day after graduation? It was a question I'd asked myself many times over the past 2 years, particularly during the early months, when the family relationships felt more like business negotiations than emotional connections. I regret that it took something that dramatic to get our parents' attention. I regret that I had to become their landlord before they would treat me like an adult whose feelings mattered, but I don't regret doing it because it worked. It forced everyone to confront the way our family had been functioning, and it gave me the power to demand better treatment instead of just hoping for it. Michael nodded thoughtfully, swirling his beer glass, while he processed what I'd said. I think I understand now why you felt like you had to do something that extreme. For most of my life, I just accepted the way Mom and Dad treated you as normal family dynamics. I never really thought about how it must have felt to always be the one whose achievements were minimized or whose opinions were dismissed. It wasn't your job to fix our family relationships, Michael. You were just a kid, dealing with your own stuff. But I'm glad you can see it now, because it helps me believe that people really can change and grow. The conversation shifted to other topics: his plans for expanding the construction business, my work in cybersecurity, the ways both of our lives had evolved beyond what anyone in our family had predicted when we were teenagers. But underneath the casual discussion was a deeper recognition that we'd all learned something valuable about the difference between obligatory family relationships and chosen family relationships. 2 weeks later, I flew back to Portland for the closing meeting, where ownership of 1247 Maple Street would transfer back to Robert and Linda Thompson. The house looked better than it had in years, with fresh paint, updated landscaping, and the kind of meticulous maintenance that comes from people who understand they could lose access to something they value if they don't take proper care of it. My parents had aged in subtle ways during the 2 years since graduation day, but they also seemed more relaxed, more confident. Like they'd finally figured out how to be comfortable in their own skin. The financial stress that had characterized their behavior during my college years had been replaced by the satisfaction that comes from rebuilding something you'd nearly lost. The closing process was surprisingly emotional for all of us. As I signed the papers that would transfer the property deed back to my parents, I realized I wasn't just selling a house. I was closing a chapter of our family history that had been defined by conflict, misunderstanding, and power imbalances. But I was also opening a new chapter defined by mutual respect, clear communication, and the kind of genuine affection that can only exist between people who have chosen to value each other rather than simply tolerating each other out of obligation. Maya, we want you to know that this isn't about going back to the way things were before, my mother said as we walked through the house one final time before the ownership transfer was complete. We like the people we've become in the past 2 years, we like the relationship we have with you now. Buying the house back isn't about changing any of that. It's about being able to invite you over for dinner in our own home instead of feeling like we need permission from our landlord, my father added with a smile that suggested he was finally comfortable with the humor in the situation. The financial benefits of the sale were substantial but almost secondary to the emotional satisfaction of the transaction. I'd purchased the house for $750,000 during my parents' financial crisis, and I was selling it back for $1.2 million, reflecting both market appreciation and the improvements that had been made during the rental period. More importantly, the profit from the sale would fund the next phase of my career development. I'd been considering starting my own cybersecurity consulting firm, building on the reputation and expertise I'd developed during my time at the fintech company. The money from the house sale, combined with my existing savings and investment portfolio, would provide the financial foundation for launching a business that could compete with established firms in the rapidly growing cybersecurity market. 6 months later, Thompson Security Solutions opened its doors in a sleek office space in Austin's technology corridor. The irony of using my family name for a business that existed because my family had initially failed to recognize my professional potential wasn't lost on anyone, least of all me, but the name choice was deliberate and meaningful. Thompson Security Solutions represented the synthesis of everything I'd learned about building strength from adversity, creating value from rejection, and transforming family dysfunction into personal and professional success. The business grew faster than I'd anticipated, attracting clients who were drawn to our combination of cutting-edge technical solutions and practical understanding of how security breaches actually happen in real-world business environments. Within 18 months, I was employing 15 people and turning down potential clients because we were operating at capacity. More significantly, the success of Thompson Security Solutions had attracted attention from industry publications, conference organizers, and professional associations who recognized that my story represented something larger than individual achievement. It demonstrated how people who grow up feeling undervalued and misunderstood often develop precisely the skills and perspectives that make them exceptional at solving complex problems. I started speaking at conferences and workshops, not just about cybersecurity technical issues, but about the psychological and emotional aspects of building successful careers in competitive fields. My presentations always included the story of graduation day and the mortgage purchase, not because I wanted to embarrass my family, but because it illustrated important principles about self-advocacy, boundary setting, and the difference between seeking approval and demanding respect. The speaking engagements led to mentorship opportunities with young women in technology who were struggling with family members who didn't understand or support their career choices. Many of them had stories that echoed my own experiences, parents who worried that computer science degrees would make their daughters antisocial, siblings who couldn't understand why anyone would choose programming over more traditional career paths, extended family members who made jokes about playing with computers while missing the enormous professional and financial potential of technology careers. Working with these young women reminded me daily that my experience hadn't been unique or unusual. Countless intelligent, ambitious people grow up in families that love them but don't understand them, that want the best for them but can't recognize their actual strengths and interests. The difference between those who thrive despite family misunderstanding and those who abandon their authentic paths to pursue family-approved alternatives often comes down to financial independence and emotional resilience. The mortgage purchase had given me both, creating a situation where I could demand better treatment because I no longer needed my family's financial or emotional support to survive. 3 years after selling the house back to my parents, I received a call that surprised me more than Michael's unexpected visit to my Austin office had. Maya, this is going to sound strange, but I have a business proposition for you. It was my father's voice, more confident and professional than I'd ever heard it during family conversations. Thompson Construction has been getting requests for technology integration services, security systems, smart home installations, network infrastructure for small office buildings. It's not work we know how to do, but it's work our clients need and want to pay for. He paused, and I could sense him gathering courage for whatever he was about to propose. I was wondering if Thompson Security Solutions might be interested in partnering with Thompson Construction on some of these projects, not as a favor to family, but as a legitimate business opportunity that could benefit both companies. The proposal was unexpected but not unwelcome. Smart building technology was indeed a growing market, and partnering with an established construction company would provide access to clients and projects that might otherwise be difficult to reach. More importantly, working with my father's company would represent the ultimate transformation of our relationship from one based on family obligation to one based on mutual professional respect. Dad, that's actually a very interesting idea. Why don't you put together a formal proposal outlining the types of projects you're thinking about, and I'll have my team review the technical requirements and market opportunities? You mean it? You'd actually consider working with us? I'd consider working with any construction company that could provide access to clients who need cybersecurity and smart building solutions. The fact that it's your company just makes the partnership potentially more interesting. 6 months later, Thompson Construction and Thompson Security Solutions announced their formal partnership at a joint press conference that attracted attention from local business publications and industry trade journals. The collaboration represented something unique in both the construction and technology industry, a family business partnership built on professional competence rather than family loyalty. The joint ventures were successful beyond anything either company had achieved independently. Thompson Construction's reputation for quality work and reliable service provided credibility for technology projects, while Thompson Security Solutions' technical expertise opened up entire market segments that traditional construction companies couldn't access. More importantly, working together professionally gave my father and me a new language for communicating about my career and achievements. Instead of vague comments about computer work that he didn't understand, we could have detailed conversations about project timelines, client requirements, technical specifications, and business development strategies. For the first time in my adult life, my father could see exactly what I did for a living and understand precisely why clients were willing to pay premium prices for my expertise. He watched me conduct technical presentations to corporate executives, negotiate complex contracts with major clients, and manage teams of highly skilled professionals who looked to me for leadership and guidance. The transformation in his understanding of my professional capabilities was complete and genuine. During one particularly challenging project, where we were installing comprehensive security systems for a new office complex, he pulled me aside after a client meeting where I'd successfully addressed every technical concern and timeline question the building owners had raised. Maya, I owe you an apology that's about 25 years overdue. I never understood what you were building or what you were capable of. I thought I was protecting you from making impractical career choices, but I was actually trying to limit you to opportunities I could understand. I'm sorry it took me this long to see how wrong I was. It was the apology I'd wanted my entire life, offered freely rather than extracted through legal pressure or financial leverage. More importantly, it came with concrete evidence of changed behavior rather than just words about changed attitudes. My relationship with my mother evolved differently, but no less meaningfully. Instead of focusing on professional collaboration, we discovered that we could actually enjoy each other's company when the underlying tension of family disappointment and criticism was removed from our interactions. She started visiting Austin regularly, not to check up on me or offer unsolicited advice about my life choices, but simply because she enjoyed spending time with the person I'd become. We'd explore the city's art galleries and music venues, try new restaurants, attend cultural events that neither of us would have chosen when I was younger. During one of these visits, as we sat on my apartment balcony watching the sunset over downtown Austin, she said something that crystallized how much our relationship had changed. Maya, I want you to know that I'm proud of who you are, not just what you've accomplished. I like the person you've become, and I realize now that you became this person partly because you refused to let us limit you to what we thought was possible. Mom, you and Dad weren't trying to limit me, you were trying to protect me from what you saw as risky or impractical choices. The problem was that you were protecting me from the very things that turned out to be my greatest strengths. I know that now, but it took watching you build a successful business and seeing how happy you are in the life you've created for me to understand that parents don't always know what's best for their children. Sometimes the best thing we can do is get out of the way and let our kids become who they're meant to be. 5 years after graduation day, I stood in the same university auditorium where I'd received my computer science degree, but this time I was on the other side of the podium. The dean had invited me to deliver the commencement address to the newest graduating class, and my speech focused on the theme of turning adversity into advantage. In the audience, I could see my entire family, parents, siblings, even some cousins and aunts and uncles, who had driven from Portland to Austin specifically to hear me speak. They were all there by choice, not obligation, genuinely proud of what I'd achieved, and genuinely interested in what I had to say. The girl who had once felt invisible in her own family was now addressing an auditorium full of people who had come specifically to hear her thoughts on success, resilience, and the importance of staying true to your authentic path, even when the people who love you don't understand it. 5 years ago, I sat where you're sitting today, listening to a commencement speaker talk about following your dreams and believing in yourself. I told the graduates, what that speaker didn't mention is that sometimes the people who love you most will be the ones who have the hardest time understanding your dreams. Sometimes the biggest obstacles to achieving your potential aren't external barriers, but the limitations that well-meaning family members try to place on your ambitions. I looked out at the audience, seeing young faces that reminded me of my own uncertainty and determination at their age. Being underestimated isn't a disadvantage, it's camouflage. When people don't expect much from you, they don't watch what you're building, they don't interfere with your planning, they don't try to control your strategy. They give you the space to develop your abilities and prove your worth on your own terms. The speech concluded with the story of graduation day and the mortgage purchase, not as a tale of revenge, but as an example of how dramatic action is sometimes necessary to break dysfunctional patterns and establish healthy relationships. The goal was never to punish my family or prove them wrong. The goal was to create a relationship dynamic based on mutual respect rather than one-sided obligation. Sometimes you have to be willing to lose the relationship you have in order to gain the relationship you deserve. After the ceremony, as families gathered in the courtyard for photos and celebrations, my parents approached me with expressions I'd never seen before. Not just pride, but genuine admiration for the person I'd become and the message I'd shared. Maya, that was incredible, my father said, his voice thick with emotion. I can't believe the person who gave that speech is the same daughter I used to worry was too shy and antisocial to succeed in the business world. She's not the same person, Dad. She's the person that daughter became when she finally had the space and support to become who she was meant to be. My mother hugged me tightly, whispering in my ear, "Thank you for not giving up on us. Thank you for forcing us to become the family you deserved, instead of just accepting the family you had." As we walked across campus together, heading to the celebration dinner they'd planned at one of Austin's finest restaurants, I realized that the mortgage purchase had been successful beyond anything I'd imagined when I initiated that wire transfer in a university parking lot 5 years earlier. I hadn't just bought a house, I'd bought the opportunity to rebuild my family relationships from the ground up, based on principles of mutual respect, clear communication, and genuine appreciation for each other's unique strengths and perspectives. The burden I'd carried for 22 years, the weight of feeling unloved and undervalued by the people who were supposed to support me unconditionally, had been transformed into the foundation for a life of purpose, success, and meaningful relationships. My name is Maya Thompson, and I learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop waiting for other people to see your worth and start building a life that demonstrates that worth so clearly that it becomes impossible to ignore. When you own your power instead of apologizing for it, you give other people permission to grow into better versions of themselves. Sometimes they take that opportunity, and sometimes they don't. But either way, you win, because you're no longer dependent on their approval to live the life you were meant to live. The girl who smiled through her humiliation on graduation day had been hiding something powerful behind that smile. She just didn't know yet that the power belonged to her, not to the people who had tried to diminish it. Now she knows, and she'll never forget again. 7 years had passed since that transformative graduation day, and the ripple effects of that moment in the university parking lot continued to shape not just my life, but the lives of countless others who had heard my story and found the courage to redefine their own family dynamics. Thompson Security Solutions had grown into one of the most respected cybersecurity firms in the Southwest, with offices in Austin, Dallas, and Denver. Our client roster included Fortune 500 companies, government agencies, and emerging startups who trusted us with their most sensitive digital infrastructure. But beyond the business success, the company had become a platform for something much more meaningful, proving that unconventional paths often lead to extraordinary destinations. The mentorship program I'd established had evolved into a nonprofit foundation that provided scholarships, career guidance, and emotional support to young people whose families struggled to understand their ambitions. We called it the Invisible Foundation, a name that resonated with anyone who had ever felt overlooked or dismissed by the people who were supposed to champion their dreams. Last month, I received a letter that reminded me why this work mattered so deeply. It came from a 24-year-old woman named Sarah Kim, whose parents had spent years pressuring her to abandon her computer science studies and pursue what they considered a more appropriate career for their daughter. "Dear Maya," the letter began, "3 years ago, I was ready to drop out of my programming bootcamp because my parents convinced me I was wasting time on something I'd never be good at. Then I heard you speak at a conference in Seattle, and you told the story about buying your parents' mortgage. For the first time in my life, I understood that I didn't need my family's permission to believe in myself." Sarah had gone on to complete her studies, land a position at a major tech company, and recently launched her own artificial intelligence startup. More importantly, she had learned to set boundaries with her family that allowed them to maintain their relationship while respecting her professional choices. "My parents still don't fully understand what I do," the letter continued, "but they've learned to trust that I know what I'm doing. They've seen the evidence of my success, and they've realized that supporting me doesn't require understanding every detail of my work. Thank you for showing me that it's possible to demand respect without destroying relationships. Stories like Sarah's arrived regularly, each one a reminder that the pain I'd experienced growing up in a family that didn't understand me had been transformed into something that helped others navigate similar challenges. The girl who had felt invisible in her own family had become a voice for thousands of people who were tired of being overlooked or dismissed. My relationship with my own family had continued to evolve in ways that surprised all of us. The professional partnership between Thompson Construction and Thompson Security Solutions had become so successful that we were exploring the possibility of creating a joint venture focused specifically on smart building technology. My father, who had once worried that computers would make me antisocial, now bragged to his construction industry colleagues about having a daughter who was revolutionizing building security systems. During our most recent family dinner, held at the house that had once been the symbol of our dysfunction, and was now simply the place where my parents lived by choice, rather than financial desperation, my mother made an observation that captured how far we'd all traveled. Maya, do you realize that you've never once said, "I told you so," about any of this? Not when your career took off, not when the business became successful, not when people started recognizing your expertise. You had every right to gloat, but you never did. She was right. Throughout all the professional success and family reconciliation, I had never felt the need to rub their faces in their earlier dismissal of my abilities. The satisfaction came not from proving them wrong, but from proving myself right about what was possible when someone refused to accept limitations imposed by other people's fears or misunderstandings. I didn't need to say "I told you so, Mom," the results spoke for themselves. And besides, the goal was never to make you feel bad about your earlier attitudes. The goal was to create space for all of us to become better versions of ourselves. The transformation had been mutual. While I had learned to demand respect and set boundaries, my parents had learned to offer support without requiring understanding, to celebrate achievements even when they didn't fully grasp their significance, and to treat their adult children as independent individuals rather than extensions of their own hopes and fears. My siblings had grown as well. Jessica had left her marketing job to start her own consulting firm, inspired partly by watching me build Thompson Security Solutions from the ground up. Michael had expanded Thompson Construction beyond traditional building projects, incorporating sustainable design principles and innovative construction techniques that positioned the company as a leader in environmentally conscious development. The entire family dynamic had shifted from one based on hierarchy and control to one based on mutual respect and individual autonomy. We chose to spend time together because we genuinely enjoyed each other's company, not because we felt obligated by blood relationships or family expectations. Last Christmas, as we gathered around the same table, where I had once felt invisible during family conversations, my father raised his glass for a toast that would have been unimaginable 7 years earlier. To Maya, who had the courage to demand better from all of us, and the patience to wait for us to rise to meet her standards. We're all better people, because she refused to settle for the family dynamic we thought was good enough. It was a moment of recognition that went beyond simple pride in my professional achievements. It acknowledged that the difficult confrontation in that parking lot, the mortgage purchase that had seemed so extreme at the time, and the long process of rebuilding our relationships had benefited everyone involved. The house itself remained a symbol of transformation rather than conflict. My parents had not only bought it back, but had invested in improvements that reflected their renewed financial stability and sense of ownership. The garden where my mother now grew vegetables and flowers was more beautiful than it had ever been when they were struggling to make mortgage payments while dismissing their daughter's unconventional career path. Standing in that same backyard, where I had once felt like an outsider in my own family, I reflected on the journey that had brought us all to this point. The girl who had absorbed criticism and dismissal for 22 years had grown into a woman who understood the difference between demanding respect and demanding perfection from the people she loved. My name is Maya Thompson, and I learned that the most powerful thing you can do isn't to prove other people wrong, but to prove yourself right about what you're capable of achieving. When you stop waiting for permission to pursue your dreams and start building the evidence of your own worth, you create opportunities for everyone around you to grow beyond their limitations. The burden I once carried has become the foundation for a life of purpose, success, and meaningful relationships with people who have chosen to see me clearly rather than trying to fit me into their preconceived notions of who I should be. Sometimes it takes dramatic action to break patterns that have persisted for decades. Sometimes you have to be willing to risk everything you think you want in order to create space for what you actually deserve. But when you find the courage to demand better treatment and the patience to wait for people to meet your standards, you discover that transformation is possible, even in the most stuck relationships. The smile I wore on graduation day was hiding something powerful. Now I know exactly what that power was. The unwavering belief that I deserved better treatment than I was receiving, and the determination to create conditions where better treatment became the only option. That power belongs to anyone brave enough to claim it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.